presentation, that'd be fine.
All righty. Again, I said these are reflections from an observer. I'm no expert, and I picked out, in my opinion, the salient points. So to start, first off, I would say, what is COP? Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, referred to as the UNFCCC. It was established at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and its goal was to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to prevent warming. And the COP part of it was created as kind of the governing body, and it was intended to meet annually, be attended by decision makers, environmental experts, intergovernmental agencies, and non-governmental agencies, of which the League is a approved non-governmental agency at COP. And the presidency and the location rotates around 5 UN regions. And my first question was, how is the League involved with the UN? And I learned even before it was established, they launched a campaign to help the public understand the need for United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF. And actually at the Charter Conference in 1945, President Truman invited the League as a to be a consultant to the US delegation. And we have continued our presence there since then. In 97, we were granted special consultative status, which meant that not only can we be a consultant to the League or to the UN where we have expertise, but we can also submit formal oral or written statements on issues that we support, which is, you'll see we've done quite a bit. And we have quite a history with the UN. In supporting issues that relate to women and girls, gender equity, discrimination, violence against women. So we've been and continue to be very active. And the League periodically hosts a League Day at the UN, where I guess you can come in and see what it's like, which I definitely want to find out more about that. To give you a brief history of COP. In the beginning, the first COP was held in Berlin, and it was a series of indefinite commitments and agreements. You could pick and choose. In Geneva, they sent binding quantitative targets to limit greenhouse gases, but by industrialized countries. In Kyoto, they set those to be binding targets. But 2 of the largest emitters, and you will hear this again, the US and China refused to ratify. Without their support, the agreement went nowhere, and COPs 4 through 12 were really of little consequence. COP 13 in Bali created Climate Justice Now, which was the first step in giving rights to basically developing countries to manage their natural resources in a sustainable manner, i.e. not be exploited. COP 14, they were talking again, build up to COP 15. One important thing from COP 14 was that there was an agreement to transfer technologies to developing countries and those in need. So as they build out their economies, they could do so in a sustainable manner. Copenhagen, the goal was to get legally binding agreements, but again, the United States and China said nothing would be binding. Therefore, that was considered a failure. COP 16, some progress. The Green Climate Fund was established, and you'll hear more about this later, related as known as loss and damage. It's basically a way for developed countries who caused a lot of the pollution, greenhouse gases, to compensate developing countries who are currently absorbing the impact of those in a very negative way. Again, COP 17, 18, they were trying to revive the Kyoto Protocol, but without the US and China, wasn't going anywhere. And it was also disappointing because at that point, 2012 emissions were already double those of 1990. In Warsaw, the UN report came out that pretty much nailed it and said, we know the reason for global warming, man-made activity. They wanted to set a reduction, emission reductions, but there was strong opposition to the goals, and disheartened, China and over 100 developing countries walked out of the COP, followed by World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, etc. So that was not a success. Finally, a turning point in Lima, COP 20. For the first time, both the US and China committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There was also the Gender Action Plan was developed. I'll mention that a little bit later. COP 21, I'm sure everyone has heard of the Paris Agreement, Paris Accord, however you call it. There was a limit, the temperature goal to limit global warming to below 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And it was officially launched on Earth Day 2016, and there are 198 parties to date. The next 4 COPs were mostly technical meetings, because once you agree to the Paris Accord, then you got to work out all the details. Major blow was the US under President Trump withdrew, but we rejoined in 2021 under President Biden. The IPCC, which is kind of the scientific arm of the UN, kind of gave a report saying even if we achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius warm, that target, what the world would look like. And it was pretty devastating to developing countries, you know, rising sea levels, disappearance of Arctic ice, destruction of most of the coral reefs in the world. Not a pretty picture. And I'm sure you've all heard of Greta Thunberg, that Swedish teenager who kind of stood up and made adults pay attention, but it was considered disappointing. The US wasn't a party to it and nothing really got done. Then, a bit of background on the Paris Agreement. Components, it has a lot. Long-term temperature goal, adaptation, which is a way to cope with the already occurring negative effects of climate change, loss and damage. I mentioned, we'll talk a little more about that as well. Finance, technology, transparency, but most provisions are non-binding, which I didn't know. You'll see lots of shoulds and encouraged in there. There are a few elements are binding, which is basically holding any countries need to continue to their financial obligations prior to the Paris Accord, and what's called an NDC, nationally determined contribution, some aspects of that. And that is basically a country's climate action plan. You have to prepare it, communicate it, maintain it, provide information about implementation, but you don't have to actually do it, which is interesting. Glasgow, COP 26. They made more progress on details on the Paris Accord, didn't stipulate what each country must do. And one thing about COPs and the Paris Accord and all these agreements is they are consensus driven. So you've got to get agreement from everybody. They did work more on the rule book, a framework to report emissions. You've heard of carbon markets where, let's say, if one polluter can buy, they're emitting, they can buy a credit from someone who's mitigating that, i.e. planting lots of trees that are absorbing carbon. They set up a lot more rules about that. And there are a few other things they did. And I highlighted a few of the comments that came out of Glasgow. The president of the COP felt that, you know, they had kept the goal alive of 1.5 degrees. Friends of the Earth disagreed, and I thought it was interesting that the UN Secretary General highlighted the political component of COP and who contributes, who is not, who's cooperating. You know, like the US and China finally agreed to, but I thought that was an interesting comment. COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and you'll see that it says November 2nd through the 16th. There were 2 extra days tacked on, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. A lot of high-level goals and vision, inclusive, rules-based, ambitious. And when you hear them speak about ambition, what they're called, that's action. They say heightened ambition. That means, you know, let's get something done. Emissions reduction, adaptation efforts, finance, and you'll hear finance mentioned many, many times throughout here. Again, very lofty goals. First off, what does a COP look like? The parties to it. Well, as I mentioned, the UNFCCC has 198 parties. The people that show up at COP are those member states, as they're called, or nations, and their related organizations, governmental or otherwise, that do the negotiations. Media is invited, and approved observer organizations who can provide input. A key one is the non-governmental, of which the League, that's how we're in there at COP. NGOs are organized into 9 constituencies that have kind of common themes. They can share information from their members to the Secretariat at the UN. And the League is heavily, it aligns with the Women in Gender, or WAG, constituency. The setting, I can just say big, noisy, confusing, overwhelming, and that's just the blue zone. There are 3 different zones. Think of Duke Convention Center times 10 on steroids. It is massive. You need a badge to get in, government officials and such, and the accredited organizations like the NGOs. That's where you'll find negotiations taking place, panel discussions, side events, exhibits. And consider that there were more than 35,000 people in total, maybe not all at the same time, but in total at COP27. 3,000 plus speakers, 300 plus topics. So when I say overwhelming, I mean it. There's a much smaller green zone that's open to anybody, that's hosted or that's managed by the host country. And it's a way for, you know, other groups, businesses, youth, artists, whatever, to just make their voice heard. Then there's the innovation zone, which is free. Anyone can get in, but you need a badge. And that's where you find partnerships between public agencies, private companies. You'll see a lot of consulting firms in there. You'll see a lot of lobbyists in there. It's very, very interesting. I did not go, I was busy in the blue zone the entire time. I did not visit the green or the innovation zone. The process. The first days, it's basically the first 2 days are made up by all the key, heads of state, decision makers, head honchos, give speeches focusing either on what their plans are, which is usually the developed countries, and what their challenges posed by the effects of climate change, which tended to be the developing countries. And you can just see from the list I have here, the topics covered: food security, finance, investment, water security, youth, decarbonization, agriculture, gender, water, energy. I mean, it just goes on and on. It was also a platform where announcements were made by politicians and business leaders. And there were some key ones that the US did make, which I'll cover in a few slides. Negotiators, typically the world leaders meet in Bonn beforehand to kind of work out high level what they're all going to agree on. Then they show up for the first few days of COP, give their speeches, go behind closed doors, get things all nifty and agreed to, and then they leave. And their senior staff actually work out the actual negotiations. In theory, the negotiations produce a document, or what they refer to as text, T-E-X-T, that involves a lot of compromise and very precise wording. And how they move forward when they cannot get agreement is they will leave, they'll have square brackets that are empty, and that will denote areas of strong disagreement. Again, the process, the IGOs and the NGOs can attend the opening remarks and speaking events. There are some negotiations where we were permitted to attend, but obviously the high level closed door, we only hear about it afterwards. You can join a constituency group, attend the side events, visit the other zones. Huge for networking with different people from every culture and everywhere around the world. You can join a protest within the UN space in Egypt, which I and another league member did join in a protest. Even though it was within the UN space, it was shut down after about an hour. And the protest itself was developing countries were really pushing for this loss and damage fund, saying, developed countries, you made the mess, we're reaping the negative effects, so we want to be compensated and absorb the culture. So, day in the life of an observer. First thing you do is you check the daily program, and there were things from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and considering the number of speakers and the 300 plus targets, there was just, it was hard to even figure out how to spend your time without it being totally random. Catch the bus. The bus, if we have time at the end, I'll tell you about the bus. Interesting. Constituency meetings started at 9. And then after that, you can follow negotiations as you're permitted, attend the side events in the blue zone, visit the other zones, attend special speaking engagements. I was privileged to hear President Biden speak, John Kerry, and Al Gore, and network even on the bus. I actually met a professor from a university in Minnesota who I became friends with, and it was funny, she actually joined the league while she was there at the convention. You generally would meet with your colleagues and new acquaintances over dinner, and then you go back, summarize your daily events, kind of like what you did as notes for Robin, our on-site leader, and plan for the next day. With all the different side events, topics, etc., I had to pick a focus. I spent the first day kind of meandering in and out of just buildings that were massive. And like I said, it was big, noisy, confusing. And I decided toward the end of the day that I've got to pick a focus for this to be meaningful. Otherwise, I'm just, trying to cover and understand a little bit of a whole lot of things. So what I decided to focus on was food, because I love food. And you may think, okay, what does food have to do with climate change? Well, first you have to look at how climate change affects food security. Demand for food is supposed to double by 2050, and food insecurity is already a major problem in many parts of the world. And there are many interrelated factors. Increased temperatures affect plant physiology and growth cycles. Extreme weather events either provide not enough water or too much water to crops that are being grown. Rising sea levels can move the distribution of where you can grow crops and the amount. Increased CO2 levels, and I didn't know this, can have a negative impact on crop yields. And if they're grown in an abundance of CO2, can actually decrease the nutritional value. And ocean warming and acidification destroys coral reefs, which means you've got less fish to catch for food. One key example, I found rice, which is a staple food for more than half of the population. In the Philippines, a 1 degree temperature increase during the growing season was linked to a 15% reduction in yield. If you think about that, given how prominent rice plays in food security for so many nations, that can be devastating. In addition, demand for meat and dairy continues to increase in developing countries, and less plant-based proteins, but animals, their health, their growth, their reproduction is affected by food stress, especially pigs for some reason. But on the other hand, agriculture affects climate change. It contributes estimated 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, especially industrialized agriculture, these big factory farms. Sources include livestock that we all, cow farts, we all chuckle about, methane, deforestation to create farmland. You get a carbon release from burning the trees, and you're taking away a carbon sink because the trees actually take in carbon from the atmosphere. Poor farming practices means you have to use more energy, chemicals, and land to produce the same amount of food, and farming equipment that runs on fossil fuels. So you think, okay, how do we stop this cycle? Food is affected by climate change, but it also helps create the problem. So mitigation activities, which are reducing the level that is released, from global actions down to local actions. You tend to see more of the developed countries focusing on mitigation, where the developing countries focus more on adaptation. They are struggling to keep up with the demand for food, and they're bearing the brunt of the negative effects of climate change. Ways to adapt: better farming practices, no-till to keep the soil in place, carbon capture, which is, there are many programs out there that are paying farmers to plant trees, leave acres fallow, or plant a cover crop, things along those lines. Better match of crop selection to growing location. Don't try to grow bananas in Montana, so to speak. Focus more on plant-based protein, improve harvesting and storage. And then we've got engineering and more nutrition, which a number of startups and scientists are doing, hence growing a better tomato. It's kind of freaky. I watched a presentation. Financing and technology, and you will see financing over and over and over again, the need for financing. There is no single solution. It's interesting, at COP, this was the first year for a food services pavilion, which is like a holistic approach as it relates to food and the climate equation, bringing together all the stakeholders, you know, farming, production, storage, government, financiers, scientists, innovators. And it was a year of first. It was, as I mentioned, the first time a food services pavilion is like an event space, like at a convention, and the first agricultural day hosted by the COP presidency. And I kind of like this quote here. It says, we can phase out fossil fuels, but we can't phase out food. So we have to transform food systems and look at it in that holistic approach. There were 5 actually event spaces or pavilions in the Blue Zone that focused entirely on food and agriculture. And there were many other pavilions that mentioned food and agriculture. So even though that was not their focus, the important point being that food is beginning to be included in the conversations when you're talking about overall climate crisis, climate change, and climate action. You'll see common themes. I've highlighted some. The food services pavilion, 15 international leaders. You'll see, you know, these were their goals and aspirations, working collaboratively, actions, strategies, solutions, spanning the entire food chain, 10 thematic days where they would have multiple presentations per day highlighting different topics. You'll see sustainable nutrition, investment, financing, climate resilient agriculture, just anything and everything you could think of. 3 other pavilions that I visited pretty frequently had a similar focus, mitigation, a lot of focus on youth. Actually throughout the entire COP itself, which was encouraging. Again, resilient agricultural practices, collaboration, role of agri-food systems in climate solutions. So I think you get a sense of this was a real first for a COP to focus this much on food. There are challenges to including food as part of the climate equation. It's difficult to identify and quantify the true value and cost of food beyond the obvious. They're stressing to factor in things such as nutrition, transport, waste. You know, those are all costs that need to be factored in. So just because a food may appear cheap, its true cost may be quite a bit more. And Unilever is tackling this with a number of nations to increase their food security by increasing nutrition, better storage, and such. Locally led adaptation is really the best, especially for developing countries, but it's hard to scale up. You have to have a lot of money and you got to have local buy-in. You don't want someone, you know, coming in and telling somebody else how to do something. It takes some amount of finesse and money. And currently only 3% of adaptation monies go to food-related solutions. There's disagreement among producers. Do you have a factory conversion to net zero? Should it be net negative emissions? Impossible Burger feels that that should be everyone's goal, which is basically by focusing on plant proteins, you're eliminating farming agriculture, i.e. livestock. And there are multiple points of view, even among agencies. The USDA's aim focus is more agri-tech, whereas ICCA claims those are false solutions that perpetuate industrial agriculture, which got us into this mess in the first place. So closing remarks, the remarks that I found, they felt the results were disappointing because more of the language about food, a holistic view of food was not written into the final text or outcome, but I viewed it as a positive given they went from 0 to 100 in 1 year at one COP. And there is some encouraging news. Again, there's a number of initiatives that will take place outside of COP, unlocking finance, recognizing nutrition, and especially this $18 trillion coalition of investors that are putting together, along partnering with the industry, a roadmap or a pathway to show how we can meet the 1.5 degree goal, being climate resilient and address nature and food security goals. So I viewed that as a positive. I'm looking at my time here. I mentioned, and I'll mention briefly, the Gender Action Plan from the Women and Gender constituency that the League is involved in. The basic focus of this, it was developed 5 years prior, and it's to increase the role of women every step of the way throughout the UNFCCC process in climate change, and increase their role, recognizing them in leadership, etc. Some other outcomes from COP. I mentioned this loss and damage fund, developed countries paying developing countries. That's the reason for the extra 2 days at the end of COP. Basically, it was not agreed to, and I guess folks just wouldn't go home until it was. Acknowledging a methane pledge. That was big. 150 countries signed on, whereas methane is not nearly as much as released into the environment as CO2, but it's much more deadly, much more toxic to the environment, and it sticks around a lot longer. They worked on the carbon trading rules. We talked about, I mentioned, let's see, person A pollutes a lot, person B plants trees, person A can buy carbon credits and say they're making progress, but they need to work out a lot of the details so double counting doesn't sneak through, things along those lines. Global goal on adaptation, it's not well funded. They only talked about a report. A lot more needs to be done there. Some positives, the geopolitical wave, the US is back. That was you heard that loud and clear through President Biden's initiatives. The president of Brazil's vision to protect or stop deforestation of the Amazon. They developed zero tolerance for net greenwashing, which means you can't just say that you're doing things green, you got to prove it. Just energy transition, helping developing countries like Indonesia transition from coal to electric power. 25% increase in investment in renewables from the prior year, and nature as a defense. In December, 190 countries got together and committed to protect 30% of the land and oceans by 2030. Not legally binding, but if you can get 190 people to agree to something, that's a really good start. I'll just mention a few of the major announcements the US made. They doubled their pledge to an adaptation fund, locally led adaptation, risk-based insurance. I highlighted the food ones, climate smart food systems, and again, expanding our methane pledge, sharing technology, et cetera, and requiring major US suppliers to set Paris-aligned reduction emission goals. That's huge. More you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, finance, 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 and finance, and money. But also encouraging, they contributed to a climate gender equity fund and investing in climate leadership for Egyptian women, which kind of ties back to that, to the gender action plan from the WAG constituency. A lot more still to be done. Loss and damage fund was agreed to, and promised by 2020, but nobody is yet paid. There's been no commitments by China or the petro-states to contribute to this fund, even though China is the #1 polluter or emitter of greenhouse gases. Ambition, basically more actions, fewer words, that I heard throughout. And another comment was made that there was a coal phase down, not out. And there's still been no mention of a fossil fuels phase down or phase out. Climate diplomacy, bringing China and India more into the fold, and subnational and local sustainability goals and progress, i.e. what can be done locally. What's coming up for COP, what's big, I mentioned part of the Paris Agreement is an NDC. It's a country's climate action plan, and you're required under the Paris Agreement to prepare it, communicate it, and maintain it, provide information so it's understandable, it's transparent, and can be tracked, and you have to update it every 5 years. Well, 2028 or COP28 will be the 5-year mark. But again, there's no obligation to implement or achieve. And what I found was it's pretty much based on name and shame, i.e. it will be very clear who has done what and who has not done anything. What they call that rendering or that review of everybody's global action, or pardon me, country's action plan is called a global stock take in 2023. And they will be, key findings from those will be presented and discussed at COP28. So it should be pretty interesting. Final note, right before the conference, the UN climate change report came out saying that according to the report, all the combined pledges of the, at that point, 193 parties that have ratified the Paris Agreement or have not, will be on track for a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century. That's not at all what we had in mind, but it did show that today's current commitments will increase emissions by 10% by 2030, going in the wrong direction. The good news is that that's better than last year, but still there's a lot more work to be done. And if you want to do something locally here, at least here in Cincinnati, if you're not familiar with the Green Cincinnati Plan, it was the last one was put in place in 2018, and it is sustainability all over in every aspect that you can think of. And one that I'm interested in is food. They actually have food in there, and it will be updated this year 2023. They're in the process of doing that now. That's it. Let me see if I can get back to.
That Green Cincinnati plan will be lodged in March, the full complete one, and they're still revising it now. This is Jane.
Okay.
Yeah.
I figured that that you folks would you would know more
Yeah.
about it than I do.
This is really so much information. Can we have a copy of your notes?
With a caveat that I gave at the beginning, which is I am not an expert on climate change. I'm not an expert on COP. And what I've done is my observations and research I've pulled together. I've obviously not included everything, just what I felt was important and relevant and wanted to share, but it is by no means a complete Bible on the topic.
Yeah, well, what do you suspect is the resistance to change at these conferences? What is holding us back?
Depends if you're a developed country or a developing country. There are still developed countries that don't want to acknowledge that their contribution to the climate crisis, as I learned to call it, and they don't want to provide financing. They may want to loan money to developing countries. Where developing countries may want grants. There are climate deniers throughout. Not every country works the way the US does, and see how much we struggled to finally get to where we are today at COP and with the Paris Agreement twice, two with the Kyoto Protocol, and when they tried to revive it, the US was up there slamming it, and we pulled out in under President Trump. So, you know, even we have struggles. That's the best that I can do. And change, it's going to cost money, and it's going to change the way people live their lives.
Mm-hmm. And do you sense that the petrochemical industry, do they have lobbyists there? Are they speaking out? Yeah.
Okay. There was an increase, a 25% increase in the number of lobbyists versus COP26.
Wow.
That's what the big resistance is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Kimberly, I just want to say thank you for putting this presentation together and making it available. It was fascinating. It really, I learned so much just by listening to you. I hope that individual leagues can take this and keep spreading the word. But I'm so glad to learn about all the connections as well to the league over the years.
And the league with the UN too, absolutely. So we're not just about voting.
Right.
But thank you for having me and letting me share. I feel privileged to have gone, and I really hope I get to go next year.
Kimberly, I have one more question. Among the constituents, are some of the environmental organizations like the Sierra Club present there?
Oh, yes. Big presence. World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace.
Yes, they've been going
could even
throughout all the years. Yes. I guess this was great. And what I would like to see is more league people get this information. So I don't know how we can accomplish that, but if you can do this kind of presentation, whether it's at a live meeting or Zoom meetings, I hope that we can help you continue to get this information to league members.
It's important and it's inspiring, because for me, it was transformative. And you hear so much about climate crisis, climate change, the world is doomed. And, you know, the more you know, the worse it does look. But also to see the collective efforts of entire world was very encouraging.
Mhm. Mhm.
Kimberly, maybe we could lobby the Ohio League and ask
Mhm.
them to give you an opportunity to do a
Mhm.
presentation on this at the state convention.
Oh, great idea.
That's
Sure.
an excellent idea. Yeah.
And maybe there could even be a panel with some of the other local leagues who have been putting a lot of time and energy into environmental issues.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's one initiative is, you know, it really needs to start at home. And that's
Mhm.
not just putting out your recycling bin every other week.
Mhm.
That's a great idea to include panel members for other leagues to showcase what they're doing.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
how do we learn if we don't share?
Mhm.
Also note that Hope said in the chat that this was recorded and
Yeah.
that it will be available on the Cincinnati Area League website, you know, which would include, when we say recorded, video recorded. So you will be able to see the slides there also. And Kim, did I hear you say you were willing, if anyone wanted to ask, to individually send people copy of the slides? I think that just
Yes, as long as it's understood. I'm not an expert. These are my observations and reflections, things I've gleaned from research. So it's not a
Mhm.
treatise on it, but it sure
Mhm.
gets us a step further to understand.
We have a lot of agriculture here in Ohio. This should be so relevant
Yes,
for, you know, most of our state.
there are a number of programs here I learned of within the United States that groups are working with farmers to, you know, you take a farmer, their income typically is, it's not smooth year round. And any kind of change to be more sustainable is going to cost more money. So what a lot of groups are doing are meeting with farmers, signing 10-year agreements with them, saying we'll provide the funding and make up your lost income the first 2 years that you
Mhm.
implement these changes, and we'll help you pay for those changes.
Mhm.
In addition, you know, for example, as well, if they plant more trees in in some pasture land, then they theoretically should be able to sell those carbon credits on the open market, which can supplement their income as well. So things like that are happening, not just everywhere else in the world, but here within the United States.
Good, good. And I understand that farmers could also host wind farms. And, you know, they could have a number of wind turbines without disturbing their actual production of food. But I
Yeah.
think that the legislature is opposed to that. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, that's
That-
right.
Perverse.
There's also, they limit the permits for solar panels going into farmlands using those things. There's a lot of problem with at the state level that preempts a lot of good moves in agriculture to make it greener.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of opposition amongst the farmers themselves, which has been ginned up by whom I don't know, but they think it's terrible.
Mhm.
There were actually farmers at the convention who stood up and said, you know, is it real that I can get paid for carbon credits? I mean, there's a lot of distrust,
Mhm.
I gather.
Sure. Thank you very much.
okay.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim. And we will continue, and hopefully the Natural Resources Committee can think about different ways to sort of get this word out to the extent possible. But this has been really, really fascinating, very much so.
I'm glad you
Thank
enjoyed.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.